There's a kind of silence a man learns to recognize out here, and it ain't the peaceful kind. Not the hush before sunrise when the birds are still thinking about singing, and not the easy quiet of a ranch settling down after a long day's work. No. This was something tighter, heavier, the kind of silence that feels like the land itself is holding its breath. The kind that comes when a whole lot of men decide all at once to stop moving. On that fourth morning, Rhett Vance stepped out of his barn and found his valley ringed in stillness. And riders. He paused there, a grain bucket hanging from one hand, and let his gaze drift slow across the ridgelines, counting without hurry. Riders to the north. More strung along the eastern bluff. Others posted on the low rise out west. Dark shapes against the pale sky, motionless as carved stone. He didn't bolt. He didn't reach for the rifle propped beside the barn door, either. Just stood there in the thin morning light, bucket resting at his side, and let his mind circle back to the woman he'd dragged out of a dry wash 4 days earlier, and every decision he'd made since. Most men, if you asked them, would tell you they know the difference between right and wrong. They say it easy, like they're talking about the weather, because most of them have never had that belief tested where it matters. Rhett Vance wasn't much for talk like that. Never had been. 11 years back, he'd come out to this stretch of frontier wanting nothing more than a piece of land he could work honest, and a life that sat right with him. He built his place in a shallow basin where 2 low ridges leaned toward each other, and a creek ran clean from spring into late fall. He raised cattle, kept a small string of horses, grew what he needed in a modest garden through the summer months, and spent winters reading whatever books he could lay his hands on. It was a quiet life. Made sense. Rhett wasn't the sort of man who went looking for trouble. Never had to. Trouble had a way of finding folks out here all on its own. And 4 days before that morning, before the riders, before the silence tightening around his land, it found him in the shape of a woman lying still at the bottom of a dry wash, 6 miles east of his boundary. He'd been riding fence along the eastern pasture, checking a stretch his 2 hands. Bram Holt, steady and seasoned, and young Cade Roran had marked for repair the week before. The morning had been dull and overcast, that flat gray light making distances blur and the desert look half unreal. His gelding, Grain, been with him 8 of those 11 years, slowed on his own. Ears forward, nostrils flaring toward the wash. Rhett had learned long ago not to ignore that kind of signal. He reined in and followed the horse's attention. That's when he saw her. She lay at the base of the far bank, half hidden beneath the tangled roots of a dead cottonwood torn down in the last storm. If Grain hadn't drawn his eye, Rhett would have ridden right past and never known. Even from a distance, he could tell she was Apache, Sierra, though he didn't know her name yet. The beadwork along her dress caught what little light there was. She was on her side, one arm stretched across the sand, too still, wrong kind of still, not sleeping, not resting, something else. Rhett swung down from the saddle and made his way into the wash. The sand below was cool, untouched, no tracks but his own cutting across it. When he knelt beside her and pressed 2 fingers against her neck, he found a pulse. Weak, uneven, but alive. Her breathing came shallow, measured, like every breath cost her something she couldn't afford to spend. He turned her carefully onto her back, and that's when he saw it. A knife wound, low on her left side beneath the ribs. Not fresh, days old. The blood had dried dark, and the skin around it burned red and angry. She'd done what she could, packed it with moss and strips of torn cloth. It had slowed the bleeding enough to keep her alive this long, but not long enough. Without proper care, she didn't have much time left. Without proper treatment, she might have had a day left. 2 at most if luck held. Rhett Vance stayed there a long moment, crouched beside her, weighing more than just her condition. His gaze drifted across the barren wash, then out toward the open country stretching in every direction. Empty, unforgiving. Up on the ridge, grain stood waiting, calm and steady, watching him like he always did. Rhett was a practical man. And out here, practicality came with its own set of rules. A man could list a dozen good reasons to leave an unconscious Apache woman right where he found her and ride on. Folks down in the nearest town, 40 miles south, would have told him just that, said he owed her nothing, said it was dangerous. Some would have said worse, and said it like it was gospel. But Rhett's kind of practical ran deeper than that. He was the sort of man who once rode into a river crossing during a storm and found a stranger's wagon stuck fast in rising water. He hadn't known those people, never saw them again. But he still spent 2 hours waist-deep in freezing current, hauling and pushing until that wagon came loose, because it needed doing. That was the kind of man he was. Practical enough to understand risk, and decent enough to act anyway. He climbed back up the bank, pulled a rolled blanket from behind his saddle, then returned to the wash and got to work. Her name was Sierra. He didn't learn it until the second day, when the fever finally loosened its grip enough for her to speak. Even then, it came slow. Fragments at first. Just her name. Then silence. Then a few more words when her strength allowed it. She'd been traveling alone. That part didn't surprise him. She told him she'd been heading west, trying to catch up with her people, the Stonewind people, who had moved camp ahead of trouble she only hinted at, speaking in careful, measured English shaped by years of moving between worlds that didn't always welcome her. She didn't explain the wound right away, and Rhett didn't press. What had happened to her was hers to tell when she chose. That first night, he cleaned and set the wound as best he could. Boiled cloth, boiled tools, same way his mother had taught him, and her mother before that. Frontier medicine, old knowledge, the kind that kept people alive long before there were doctors within reach. He laid her in his own bed and took the chair by the door, the way a man does when someone might wake up confused, in pain, unsure if they're safe, or who they've woken up beside. By morning, the fever had broken some. By evening, she was awake enough to watch him. She tracked him with quiet, steady eyes, taking everything in, giving nothing away. There was no fear in her. Rhett saw that plain as day, and he respected it. Same way he respected how little she wasted. No movement, no energy spent without reason. On the third day, she started sitting up, despite him telling her to take it slow. She moved like someone who knew her body well, like a craftsman handling tools he'd used his whole life. Even worn down by injury, she carried strength in the way she held herself. She was maybe 30, lean, tough. And there was something in her attention, sharp, controlled, that reminded Rhett of seasoned trackers, the kind who read a landscape without ever seeming to try. That third evening, she finally told him about the wound. 3 nights before he found her, she'd been making camp when 2 men stepped out of the dark. Settlers, maybe, or men working for them. She hadn't seen their faces clear enough to know. They hadn't spoken, no warning, no hesitation. They wanted her horse. Maybe more than that. She fought them, and she got away. One of them got close enough to use a knife before she broke away. The blade caught her low in the side, and she rode hard through most of that night with blood slipping out of her faster than she could afford. Eventually, she made a choice. Stop and try to hold on to what life she had left, or keep riding and bleed out in the dark. She chose to stop. Somewhere along those miles, her horse stumbled on loose rock and went lame. She left it behind at a ranch she passed, tied off quiet at the fence line. The kind of silent trust you place in a stranger without ever speaking a word. Then she kept going on foot. Rhett Vance listened without cutting in. Didn't rush her. Didn't question the gaps. When she finished, he sat there a moment, turning it over in his mind, then asked the only thing that mattered. "Do you know who they were?" Sierra gave a slight shake of her head. "No." Rhett nodded once, but his thoughts kept moving. He ran through faces. Men he knew, men he'd heard about, and the kind of men you never hear about until it's too late. The territory was wide, but not empty. Trouble always had a source. He didn't say any of that out loud. Instead, he looked at her and said, "You're safe here." And he meant it the way a man means something he's already decided is true, no matter what it might cost him later. What Rhett didn't factor in during those first 3 days was how fast word could travel across open country. Not by paper, not by riders with letters. The older way, passed from one set of eyes to another, carried in saddle talk, in quiet conversations over fences, in low voices around firelight. Cade Roran, the younger of his two hands, had been down at the trading post in Gilmer Crossing that first evening, just picking up nails and coffee. Nothing more. Somewhere along the way, he mentioned, casual as anything, that Rhett had brought someone in from the range. He didn't mean harm. Cade wasn't that kind of man, but he wasn't careful either. And sometimes, that's enough, because the wrong pair of ears caught it. That evening, those ears belonged to Dorian Voss. Voss wasn't the sort of man who showed his worst side right off. He dressed better than most men out here, spoke with care, and carried himself with an easy charm that made folks comfortable before they had time to question why. He'd been in the territory just over a year, 14 months, and in that time he'd been buying land, or leaning on folks until they sold. Cheap. Too cheap. He hadn't made a move on Rhett Vance yet, but not because he wasn't interested. The creek running through Rhett's land was the only steady water for 40 miles in any direction, and men like Voss didn't ignore water. They waited. They watched. They looked for an opening. And when he heard the word Apache tied to Rhett's place, he found one. Rhett knew none of that on the morning he stepped out and saw riders lining his ridges. All he knew was what was in front of him. Men on every rise. Still, watching. He counted slow, steady, past 40 before he stopped. Then he set the grain bucket down, straightened his back. 52 years old, and he knew one thing clear as daylight. Fear makes a man stupid if he lets it. Fear moves fast, talks loud, and most times, it's dead wrong. Rhett drew in a slow breath of the cold morning air and forced his thoughts to settle. Most of the riders were Apache, Ash Ridge riders. You could see it in the way they sat their horses, in the discipline, in the stillness that wasn't nervous but controlled. But down on the southern rise, near the trail leading to his gate, there was a different kind of presence. 8 men. White, working horses, rifles laid easy across their saddles, Voss riders. And at the front of them, mounted on a gray horse worth more than anything else in that valley, sat Dorian Voss. Voss was the first to move. He rode down the slope alone, easy and confident, like a man who believed confidence itself could carry him through anything. He pulled up at the fence and looked at Rhett with a thin layer of concern stretched over something colder. "Morning, Vance," he said. "Looks like you've gotten yourself into a situation." Rhett met his gaze without blinking. "Tell me what you think I'm in," he said evenly, "and we'll see how close you get to the truth." Voss lifted a hand and gestured toward the ridgelines circling the valley. "You've been keeping an Apache woman here," he said smoothly. "I don't know what kind of arrangement you thought you had, but words reached her people that she was taken. They came to get her back, and they're not the sort to sit around listening to explanations. He let that hang a moment, then added, I rode out here to give you a chance to step aside before this turns ugly. Rhett Vance repeated the words under his breath. Step aside. His eyes stayed on Voss, steady and unreadable. Your land, Voss continued. That's a matter for another day. Right now we're talking about keeping you alive. Rhett gave a small nod, his tone flat as dry ground. I appreciate the concern. But there wasn't a trace of gratitude in it. He'd heard this kind of offer before. Knew its shape. Knew how something dressed up as help was usually just a door leading somewhere else, and that somewhere else always came with a cost. He'd seen Dorian Voss's name on the papers that had passed through neighboring hands. Read enough to understand how deals like this ended. I'll take my chances, Rhett said. Handle things my own way. Something in Voss's face shifted. The polished concern slipped off, leaving something colder underneath. You're looking at Apache warriors, Vance, he said. 40 of them. Rhett didn't even glance around. I can count. And with that, he turned his back on Voss. It was a risk, a deliberate one. He walked to the gate, unlatched it, and stepped through without hurry. Then he started up the northern slope toward the largest group of riders. No rush, no hesitation. Hands loose and open at his sides. Behind him, Voss barked something sharp to his men. But Rhett didn't catch the words, and he didn't turn to look. Up on the ridge, the Ash Ridge riders watched him approach. They didn't move to block him, didn't reach for weapons. They just watched. And there was something in that watching. Something Rhett recognized. He'd seen it in Sierra over the past 4 days. That same steady attention. Taking in everything. Holding judgment back until there was enough truth to act on. That was why he kept walking toward them. Not away. In 4 days of tending to her, Rhett had learned something he trusted more than most things out here. That the way a person watches the world tells you more than anything they say. And these riders, they watched the same way she did. He reached the crest and stopped about 20 feet from the nearest horse. The man at the center stood out without trying. Older, still, but not the stillness of waiting. The kind that comes from a man who doesn't have anything left to prove. No war paint, no weapon in his hands, just presence. Torin. He looked at Rhett like a man studying a question he meant to answer honestly. Rhett met his gaze and spoke plain. She's safe. No flourish, no explanation at first. Just truth. She was cut bad, he went on. Knife wound. Needed care. I gave what I could. She's at my place, healing. She stayed because she chose to, not because I kept her. Silence settled between them. One of the younger riders off to the side shifted slightly in his saddle, tension flickering through the movement. Without even turning his head, Torin lifted 2 fingers in a small gesture, and the rider stilled instantly. Rhett went on. I don't know what you've been told, he said, voice steady. But whatever story made its way out here, you're welcome to come down and hear it from her yourself. Then he stopped talking, and waited. The pause that followed wasn't empty. It carried weight, the kind that comes when a man is measuring truth, not just hearing words. The older man spoke at last, his English clipped, deliberate, every word placed with care. You did not call soldiers? Rhett shook his head. No. You did not ride to town, did not speak of what you found? No. Another pause settled in. Then the question came, simple and sharp. Why? Rhett took a breath, turning that over before answering. Not searching for something clever, just something true. Because it wasn't my story to tell, he said. It was hers. Something shifted among the Ash Ridge riders. You couldn't see it plain, couldn't hear it, but it moved through them like a change in wind, subtle, undeniable. Torin held Rhett's gaze a moment longer. Then he nudged his horse forward 3 slow steps. The others followed without hesitation, and together they turned and started down off the ridge toward the ranch. That was the moment everything tilted. The point where what had come before met what was about to follow. Dorian Voss had not planned for that. He'd ridden out that morning with a clean story in his head and 8 armed men, the Voss riders, to make sure it held. Simple enough. Create a crisis, step in as the solution, and leave Rhett owing him. After that, the land would come easy. That had been the plan. What he hadn't counted on was this. He hadn't counted on the Ash Ridge riders coming to confirm a truth, not reclaim a captive. Hadn't counted on the Stonewind people trusting Syra enough to ask questions before drawing blood. And he sure as hell hadn't counted on Rhett Vance walking straight up to 40 armed riders like he was settling a fence line dispute. That wasn't part of any plan. When the riders came down into the yard, Syra stepped out of the cabin on her own. She moved slow, careful. The wound hadn't finished healing, and every step carried weight. But she didn't lean on anyone, didn't ask for help. She crossed the yard under her own strength and stopped in the morning light, facing Torin on his gray horse. She spoke to him in Apache, low, steady, certain. Torin listened. Then his eyes moved, first to Rhett, then to the cabin, then to the bandaging still visible beneath the edge of her dress. He answered her in the same tongue, just as brief. At once, 2 riders, Mika and Tarek, slid down from their saddles and stepped forward. Syra turned to them, speaking quietly for several minutes, while Torin remained mounted, his attention drifting across the yard. To Dorian Voss. By then, Voss had already brought his men down from the southern rise, not because he wanted to, but because staying up there, watching from a distance, made him look exactly like what he was. A man who'd set a play in motion and was now watching it fall apart. So he stepped into it. He stood in the yard now, doing what he always did when things slipped out of his control. Talking. He spoke about safety, about protecting the community, about the concerns of settlers trying to survive in hard country. Every word polished, measured, aimed straight at Torin, as if he could talk the man into seeing the world the way he needed him to. But Torin wasn't listening the way Voss expected. He listened the same way he had on the ridge. Quiet, patient, taking everything in, holding it against what he already knew. There was no urgency in him, no reaction, only judgment, the kind that comes from a man who has heard every version of a lie and learned how to tell when words are being used as tools instead of truth. Then he spoke. Not loudly, not directed at anyone in particular, but his voice carried across the yard all the same. "This man brought guns," he said, "to take what was not threatened." Voss opened his mouth to answer, to twist it, reshape it. But Torin looked at him, and that was enough. The words died before they ever left his throat. Off to the side, Bram Holt had stepped out from the bunkhouse. He stood quiet at the edge of the yard, hat in his hands, his face still as weathered wood, giving nothing away. Cade Roran stood a few steps behind Bram Holt, a whole lot less steady on his feet, tension written plain across his face. But he didn't bolt. And out here, that counted for something. Rhett Vance remained by the gate, arms loose at his sides, watching it all unfold without stepping in, without backing away. Dorian Voss made one last attempt. He turned toward Rhett, his voice dropping low, but not low enough to keep the rest of the yard from hearing it. "You're making yourself an enemy today, Vance," he said, Think carefully. It was meant to sound like advice, but it didn't land that way. It landed like what it really was, a quiet admission that the morning hadn't gone his way. And a man who says think carefully as he's backing off is never a man who's finished with you. Rhett held his gaze. "I've already done my thinking," he said evenly, "and I'll keep doing it." That was all. Voss studied him a second longer, then turned away. No argument. No final push. He and the Voss riders rode out without ceremony, heading south the same way they'd come. Hooves struck dry ground, the sound fading slow into distance until it disappeared altogether. Silence settled back into the yard. The Ash Ridge riders who had dismounted were already climbing back into their saddles. Movements calm, controlled. Torin guided his horse forward, stopping beside Rhett. He looked down at him for a moment before speaking. "The woman says you took nothing from her," he said. "She says you gave what was needed, and asked for nothing." Rhett gave a small nod. "That's right." Torin studied him a second longer. "In our experience," he said, "this is not common." Rhett let out a quiet breath. "It should be," he said, "but I know it isn't." Something shifted in Torin's expression. Not quite a smile, but close enough to it to matter. He spoke to Sira in Apache. She listened, then turned back to Rhett and translated. "My uncle says, a man who gives without keeping count deserves to know what he's been given in return." She paused, then continued. "He says your land will be known to our people as a place where no one needs to ride in fear. Your cattle will be left alone. And if anyone comes against you because of what you did, word will reach him." Her eyes held his as she finished. "And it will be remembered." It wasn't a bargain, wasn't a debt. It was something else. Recognition. The kind that comes when one person has watched another long enough to know exactly what they're made of. Rhett accepted it without making it smaller, without brushing it off, just nodded once. The riders began to move out then, same way they'd come. No rush, no noise, just quiet purpose. Sira mounted the horse Torin had brought for her. She hadn't said much that morning. But before she rode out, she turned back toward Rhett and stood there a moment, still, composed, the way she always was. "You didn't know who I was," she said. Rhett shook his head. "No. And you helped anyway." "You were hurt," he said. That was enough. She watched him a moment longer, those steady eyes measuring something deeper than words. "My uncle is right," she said softly. "It is not common." Then she turned, swung into the saddle, and rode out through the gate. The Ash Ridge riders closed around her, and together they moved north, disappearing over the ridge before the dust had time to settle. Bram Holt stepped up beside Rhett after a while, both of them standing there, looking out at the now empty ridgelines. Bram wasn't much for talking. Never had been. One of the reasons Rhett kept him around. After a long stretch of quiet, Bram said, "Voss ain't done." "I know," Rhett replied. "You ready for that?" Rhett bent, picked up the grain bucket he'd set down what felt like a lifetime ago. "I'll be ready." He turned and headed back toward the barn to finish what he'd started that morning. Bram drifted off to his own work. Cade stayed where he was a while longer, staring at the empty ridges. Something like relief and something like respect settling in behind his eyes. An expression caught somewhere between relief and humility, about the only expression that fit a morning like that. Dorian Voss did come back. Men like him always do, because the kind who confuse stubbornness with principle rarely know the difference, at least not until something finally stands in their way. He came back with lawyers first, then with sharper arguments. Then with a territorial land agent he'd clearly been working on for some time. Brig Halver, a man who knew how to dress authority up to look like law. But something in that valley had shifted after the morning Rhett Vance stood surrounded. And it wasn't the kind of change you noticed right off. You had to live there to feel it. It showed in the way the Dry Creek folk answered when Voss's men came calling. Polite enough, but careful. It showed in how the hollow traders at Gilmer Crossing suddenly found themselves too busy or too short on supplies when dealing with anyone tied to Voss. It lived in small things, quiet refusals, measured pauses, favors not returned. Nothing you could point to. But enough, together, to make the ground beneath a man feel less certain than it used to. Some of it, Rhett knew, was just the story spreading. Out here, stories traveled faster than horses and lasted longer than storms, and people had a taste for one like that, where a man rode in with guns and a speech already prepared, only to be seen for exactly what he was. But there was more to it than that, something harder to name. The land itself was changing, not the dirt or the sky, but the people on it. Settlers and the Stonewind people alike were getting tired of the same old pattern. Tired of violence being the first answer, the only answer, the expected answer. And when something different showed up, something quieter, steadier, they noticed, even if they couldn't quite put a word to it. Sirah came back the following spring. She rode with her people along the same route they'd followed for generations. One afternoon, she stopped at Rhett's fence while he was up on the barn roof, patching a section that winter had worn down. She called up to him, her voice calm, carrying easy in the open air. When he climbed down, she was waiting by the fence with a small bundle in her hands, cured hide, wrapped tight and tied with the same kind of cord worked into her dress. "My uncle sent this," she said. "It's a sign our people will know." She held it out. "If you hang it where it can be seen, anyone passing through who understands it will know this place is not one to fear." Rhett took it, turning it once in his hands before nodding. "Thank you." She asked about the creek. "Running strong," he said. "North Bank grass came back better than I figured." She gave a small nod, like that answered something she hadn't said out loud. "You eaten?" he asked. "I have," she said. But when he offered coffee, she accepted. They sat together on the top rail of the fence, the afternoon stretching quiet around them. Talk came easy, about what had changed, what hadn't, and the things neither of them could quite see yet but knew were coming all the same. She left before sundown. Rhett stood by the gate, watching as the Ash Ridge riders carried her over the eastern ridge until they were gone from sight. Then he took that bundle and nailed it to the fence post beside the trail, where it could be seen clear by anyone passing through. It stayed there through summer, through fall, weathered into the wood, into the place itself, not announced, not explained, just there, like it had always belonged. Bram Holt noticed it the next morning. He didn't say a word, just looked at it once, gave a small nod to himself, and went on with his work like he always did. Cade Roran saw it, too. He stood there a second longer, studying the bundle nailed to the post, then muttered under his breath, "Good." Rhett Vance heard him, gave a slight nod, and stepped back inside to finish his coffee while it was still hot. Out here, the frontier doesn't ask for the kind of man folks usually talk about. It doesn't need the loud one. Doesn't care much for speeches. More often than not, it asks for the quiet kind. The one who hands over water without asking questions when a stranger's dry. The one who patches a wound because it needs patching. The one who knows better than to call in guns when guns are only going to make things worse. That kind of man understands something most never do. that a debt carried in honesty grows different than one forced at gunpoint, and that the things that last in a hard land like this aren't built out of fear. They're built out of a simple choice to treat another person like they matter. Rhett Vance didn't ride west to become that kind of man. He came out here to be left alone. But the land doesn't care much about what a man had planned for himself. It has its own ideas. And on a flat, gray morning, 6 miles east of his pasture, down in a dry wash with a dead cottonwood stretched across it, the land showed him exactly what it expected of him. And he was ready. Not because he was special, not because he stood there and made some grand decision, but because 11 years of living straight, paying attention, and seeing things for what they were had shaped him into the kind of man who doesn't hesitate when the right thing shows up uninvited. He just does it. Sometimes that's all it takes. And sometimes that's everything.